Okay. Hello. And welcome to kind of like a special little interlude episode that I wanted to put out before the next Disco Elysium stream goes live. So, this is something I may do from time to time, kind of like taking a chunk of the analysis and putting it in its own video. Sometimes because it takes me a while to sort of collect my thoughts on things and it doesn't always happen like while we're live on stream. But also because uh, I can kind of already foresee that this playthrough of Disco Elysium is going to be quite long, going at our usual pace. Um, and I know it can be pretty hard to get into a Let's Play when it's like episode 30 or something. And so if you weren't really there for the beginning of it, it's kind of hard to hop in that far down the line. So I thought it'd be cool to kind of like do like little chunks of our character studies and like analysis of the game's systems and like how they represent different parts of mental health, like just as their own separate videos. Basically for the people who can't commit the time to watch all of the Let's Play videos or can't make it to the streams or that sort of thing, they can still enjoy kind of the psychological breakdown parts of it. So that's what we're going to be doing today. There's something that I have to talk about, basically. Like, I just couldn't really wait until the next time I get on stream to talk about it. So that's what we're going to do now. Okay, so there is something that Disco Elysium does in its portrayal of a very specific aspect of mental health that I have never seen portrayed this way anywhere else. So one of the biggest challenges when talking about anything related to mental health, whether it's depression, mental illness, addiction, is it can sometimes be really hard to explain, like, how can you want something? You could desperately want to not be depressed. You can desperately want to be sober. And yet sometimes our behaviors really don't agree with that desire. And how do you explain that to someone that is sitting there wondering, like, all I want in the world is to stop using, but I just can't, right? And this is kind of, a mentality that I imagine like our lead detective having been in at some point before he lost his memory. And at least in my playthrough, it's something he's still struggling with, right? As he does whatever he can to find a pack of cigarettes. And for me, it comes down to this. We tend to have a very limited way of talking about the subject of motivation, like why you actually do things, why you want things. And this is where Disco Elysium comes into the picture with these different aspects of the main character's psyche who seem to have different motivations for him, and they influence you as the player to sort of like follow different paths, right? One motivation in terms of the authority voice will tell you, like, you need to smack that kid, right? Don't let Kuno get one over you like that. And then at the same time, the voice coming from a place of empathy might tell you, Kuno probably doesn't really have anyone to look after him either. And one of the only ways that he has to express himself, because he doesn't have a sense of control at home, is to be vulgar. And he gets a reaction from people. He may go home and find that no one really pays attention to him, and this is how he gets that, right? This is his outlet. And so my character can have these two very different perspectives, offering him a different kind of motivation. One that says, slap the shit out of this kid, and the other that says, actually, the two of you are probably not too dissimilar. You both feel this absence of connection to the world around you, and you're both trying to express that longing for connection in different ways. So this is complicated, right? It's not always easy to explain to people why you can have two thoughts that don't necessarily agree. One that says, I want to be sober. One that says, go get as high as you can right now, right? So I'm going to pull this up here. I've got the skill system. These are all the different like voices that you tend to hear in the character's dialogue. And this is the part where Disco Elysium really gets something very right about how to explain these different sources of motivation that don't always agree. And what it comes down to is that we have this word, motivation. But I always come back to this idea that like motivation by itself, this word, it doesn't really explain what I just talked about. Like the fact that you can have like different sources of desires that are not always in harmony with one another, right? To use this word is to say, oh, I didn't do it because I wasn't motivated, right? I didn't get up early enough because I didn't have enough motivation to do it. I didn't go to the gym today because I just didn't have the motivation for it, right? Like it tries to explain desire and action potential as like a one-to-one relationship. My problem with this word is that it is very one-dimensional. So if we just think of like the start of the game, right? At the very beginning, the character wakes up and like where is his center of motivation at? The first things that we kind of learn about him is that he is like not really aware of what's going on. Like his primary motivation as the player being the character is to like figure out where you are and like get a grasp on the world, right? My first instinct when I loaded up the character was like look around at the things that you can find to like wear as clothes, like defend yourself, right? And so like one of my motivations is safety. At the same time, he starts getting pulled into like even more complicated motivations. Like he tries to get the tie down from the fan. And here we have Inland Empire telling us that like the tie is not just your tie, but it's also potentially your long lost cosmic best friend, right? And so his motivation shifts from safety to like a sense of belonging. You reach up for the tie and your body is like, actually, you can't reach for it. Like that hurts too much, right? And so it's kind of winding back to safety. Me as the character, I was like, all right, well, this is a higher priority to me right now than belonging. So I left the tie there, right? This does not mean that I'm not motivated to like have a sense of belonging. It just means that there is a priority structure that kind of like interferes with itself sometimes. So I really don't think that the word itself, motivation, really explains the psychodynamic issue at play here, right? The better way that I try to explain this to my clients is that we can be in different mental states that are in competition with one another. So instead of talking about like your lack of action potential as you just didn't want to do something, like you didn't really want to be sober, so you relapsed, instead, we try to formulate it in terms of we have different mental states that are in competition with one another. So we have competing mental states. And this is where Disco Elysium really nails that idea, right? Because here you have a mental state called empathy that is telling you, you need to make this your priority. You need to connect to something, right? As you awake from the void of nothingness and the only thing active in your brain is the reptilian side of you, like you need emotional grounding. You need to find something that anchors you to not just like who you were, but who you are and what you feel right now. At the same time, there are parts of his body, right? His electrochemistry, all that stuff I talked about with like the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system that are rejecting what empathy commands of you, right? And so electrochemistry is like in competition with empathy for your priority structure. Then we have things like logic enter the picture, right? The logical side of his brain is like, okay, well, search for things that are a compromise to this. Go find your shoe. You don't have to like reach up and grab the tie, right? You can still satisfy safety by finding your shoes, right? Perception comes into play and is like, hey, why don't you check out the window, right? And then the more you're sort of exerting yourself, like your endurance and your pain threshold, like they start vying for territory over your decision making to say, like, actually, you don't really need that much protection. Like, you're good enough with one shoe, right? And so, like, your decision making is not just a one track sort of line of like, are you motivated to do this? Do you want to do it? Then you do it. Instead, the way Disco Elysium kind of depicts this, and this is like a very accurate way of trying to explain the discord that happens in someone's mind, especially when they're, intoxicated or recovering from being intoxicated, is that you have all these different mental states that are sort of vying for your attention and are not always in agreement with one another on what you should do, right? And so that causes a lot of inner tension. Like, I don't know about you, but when I feel overwhelmed by something, right, the main feeling that I have is one of avoidance, right? I don't want to feel like I am not in control of myself or my own decision making. So I'm going to listen to the ones that are basically like the most impulsive, right? Electrochemistry is basically like threatening me that if I don't do what it wants, if I don't get the out of this environment, or if I don't like get a cigarette right now, then I'm going to die, right? It's like convincing my body that not smoking right now is the equivalent of like being eaten alive by a predator. Like that's what it's able to do because it's tapped directly into my like spinal cord and my entire like fight or flight response. And so you can imagine like even for someone who is completely sober and is just afflicted with the disease of anxiety, which we all are, like this is a mess. Like we're all a total mess and it's really hard to like sort out, you know, what our priorities should be at any given moment just when we're stressed, right? A lot of people don't want to have to spend the time to reflect and sort this out and like learn how to develop like healthy communication between these two systems and many systems. And so like what we often do is we resort to avoidance. Like I'm just not going to participate in any of this. I'm just going to go get up instead, right? I'm going to listen to this one that tells me if you don't, you know, get on something to alleviate this stress right now, then the whole thing shuts down. So like right from the beginning, Disco Elysium targets this very complicated subject of motivation and gives us a framework for understanding like as you go throughout the world, as you start talking to people and as you start making decisions as a player, like you are also going to be in contention with what these different systems ask of you, right? For like my character, he's very much built in this category. And these have different names as well in the game. So these ones are intellect, these are psyche, physique, and motorics, right? And so these are like, we can even just explain it that way to say that these are kind of like the four main categories of mental states that are often vying for territory over your decision making, right? There's an intellectual side of you that is telling you to make logical, clear decisions based on deduction and reasoning, right? But intellect doesn't always agree with your psyche because your psyche is the realm where your emotions live, right? Like inland empire, empathy, authority, volition. These are all like very emotional machines that aren't always interested in solving problems based on deduction and reasoning and observation. They are not as concerned with the ideas that perception might have in motorics about like how to solve a problem, right? They're going to rely more on emotional virtues. And so like they're going to compete with each other. And both of those systems are going to be competing with physique because physique is basically managing like the resources that the body has to send off to these different corners, right? Physique is like, look, you don't actually have the energy to go get that tie down, even if it is your best friend. And motorics may be interfering with aspects of intellect by saying like, hey, you may perceive a lot of details. You can tell there is something here, but you can't necessarily deduce the best way to deal with it. That's kind of my character, right? Like he's able to like pass these really hard perception rolls, but there's really not a lot of follow through with it. So as I was playing the game, I just found this skill system amazing, not only as like a parallel to real discussions that I have with people all the time about like the complicated nature of motivation, and that motivation is not really even the subject that we're talking about. We're talking about competition between several mental states that you can occupy all at the same time and that want different things from you. But this also works extremely well as like a narrative device, as a storytelling device, and as a game mechanic, because these are the things that as the player you're interfacing with when I'm like, yeah, well, I'm spec'd into psyche, and so I'm probably going to be more biased to follow what Inland Empire is telling me I should focus on versus like, you know, something that my physique side is telling me, right? And really like using this system to explain character motivations doesn't just apply to the detective, okay? Like think about Kim for a second. All right, Kim, He's our best boy right now, right? Kim, from the moment we meet him, has a complicated array of motivations as we do, and he is way more stable than we are, presumably. So I can imagine for Kim that he's got a lot of different mental states that are in competition with one another as well. Something that we learn, this might actually be in the second recording, I can't remember. But something we learn about him is that, like, he does care about his work, right? Like, he cares a lot about being a good detective, like doing things the right way. Like, he has a lot of dignity and integrity and respect for himself. But at the same time, I think he also presents as someone willing to bend his morals if he knows he can accomplish something he's trying to do, right? Because he also has this like cultural side to him, right? When we meet the racist lorry driver, right? Like we see Kim himself get in touch with some of these more like commanding mental states that sort of break him from the facade of someone who is always cool and calm and collected. And he confronts this gentleman, and like we see that, I think Kim would be willing to compromise on some things if he knew that it would satisfy like his cultural desires, right? So he's got two competing mental states there. Just being around us is a competition between like his structured world and the complete chaos that our character presents, right? At the same time, I think he also finds us useful as someone he can wield to accomplish this, right? Like, it's not just about competition between mental states, it's also about like, where do you start justifying what you compromise? And somewhere along the way, I really think that he does compromise logic and maybe his empathy and some of his volition. Like he compromises those things to allow us to do our thing. In some ways, maybe because he can relate to us. I think there's maybe a part of Kim that is a little bit like shackled by his structured way of being, and being around the detective vicariously, he gets to experience his own inner chaos. Like we are the conduit for him exploring what would happen if I don't compete and I don't try to win out and I don't try to learn to communicate healthily between any of these systems. What if I just like embrace chaos and follow whatever impulse comes to me, right? Like, I don't think he can let himself do that. And so he allows the detective to do that, right? That's what makes Detective Kato and Kim great foils for each other, right? A foil is not necessarily a character who is the opposite of another character, but it's someone whose qualities, like when we see how structured and mannered and, let's say, by the book that Kim is, when we see him express those qualities, it creates a major contrast with our own character and amplifies our awareness of these qualities, right? Like if you put two people who are like Kim next to each other, we don't necessarily notice how important these things are for keeping his whole worldview intact, right? But the second you put him next to the detective or someone like Kuno, that's where the contrast really comes through, and we start to see where those compromises happen. Because at least in my playthrough, I got Kim to try to shoot down the body, right? This is not something that fits with this worldview that we normally might associate with him with, right? I think somewhere in the mix, we got to see what it was like when Kim wasn't able to sort of stifle the competition between some of his own more pressing mental states. And right down here, this mental state lost to any number of these that sort of represent pride, right? And that's what makes them as a dynamic, no matter what kind of playthrough I imagine you're having, so fun and so unique to watch, is because like you are the character who is not really trying to stop these mental states from having fierce competition, and you are like literally just letting whichever one is strongest drive you, especially because as the player, like you want to explore and exhaust as many options as you can to get the best outcome. Like in trying to play optimally as a character, we end up allowing our character that we're playing to be totally dysregulated and unpredictable, right? We can't play as someone necessarily like Kim and get the most optimal result because it very rarely takes sort of like allowing this competition between the mental states to resolve itself in a neat and structured and orderly way. So that's one of the ideas that I was having as I was playing through just like the first couple hours of Disco Elysium. Like I said, this is something that is not super easy to explain to people in clinical practice sometimes, other than to say that, like, first we're going to try to demonstrate that motivation is not really, it's not sufficient enough of an idea to explain why behaviors that we don't want continue. If this is like my 20th time trying to get sober and I'm still relapsing, right? It's something that our main character is probably still dealing with. Like, he doesn't want to have headaches. He doesn't want to feel like he hates himself. He doesn't want to be confused about who he is. Or maybe he does, right? I guess we're going to find out. But if we assume good intentions, if we even just assume that getting what he wants, even if it's like really simple and primal, the things that he wants, if that requires being in, good health and having good perception, reaction speed, in, having a healthy physical instrument, a healthy body, if that requires it, then you should be invested in, not killing yourself moment to moment by like desperately hounding everyone you see for a pack of ciggies, right? But that's what he does anyways. That's what my character is doing, because this is not as simple as, well, if you just want it bad enough, you would work harder on it. I think that that's the big myth in any sort of mental health. It's like, if you just wanted to be happy enough, you would find a way to do it. It's not that simple, right? That is a very one-dimensional way of thinking about things. Wanting something is not enough to resolve the inner sort of turmoil that happens when you have different priority structures all vying for your attention and for your decision-making power. So that brings me to, like, okay, this is a problem. How do you actually work on it? Like, what would I do with, let's say, myself, the detective, or someone like Kim, maybe even more appropriately, because I feel like he just is more ready to be in therapy than the detective. Like, I think that guy needs like serious detoxing before like any level of talk therapy would even be effective with him. But one of the approaches that I find very useful in working on situations like this is an approach called internal family systems. It's also called IFS. So, internal family systems is a type of therapy in which the framework you're using is that we consider the inner parts of ourselves to be like a close family of individuals, right? And so we would use the terminology of parts to describe like a part of you that's angry, a part of you that, wants to still use, a part of you that wants to be sober, right? A part of you that wants to smack Kuno in the face, and a part of you that wants to give him a healthy home to return to, right? Like, there are disparate parts of ourselves that, in the same way that I was talking about here, may not always agree with each other. And so the goal of IFS therapy is to learn how to like develop lines of communication between these things. And so now I would imagine like the character saying something like, well, you know, that part of me feels like it's never quite in control, right? There's a sense of authority that's missing, right? The part of me that's angry struggles the most with authority, and you could attach those two, ideas to each other. And you could say, okay, well, what about the part of you that can sort of understand where Kuno is coming from, and that his expression of vulgarity is his way of like controlling his own competing mental states, right? And you may be able to connect that part of yourself with, a source of empathy. And so we might actually engage in that process by saying like, okay, well, what would a conversation between these two parts look like? Where do you think there is some common ground between these two parts that don't agree, right? So IFS is something I can imagine being pretty useful here. It's not something I'm like super specialized in, but I do find the framework of discussing the self as different parts that actually all have the potential to want the same thing, and sort of being the pursuit of like finding what that thing is and working to make this a common shared goal within yourself. And so it's something that I think could really benefit these two gentlemen in particular. So that's a little bit of a breakdown on kind of my thoughts so far on one of the very interesting ways that Disco Elysium portrays mental health. I genuinely think that like the way it has integrated these ideas as a like narrative dialogue skill system is absolutely ingenious and really gives us like a framework for discussing something that is not always easy to grasp by the person who isn't necessarily sure about why they feel like they're being pulled in these different directions, right? And like I said, this is a subject that is relevant to not just addiction, but is relevant to depression, any kind of mental illness, or even just like a normal, healthy person who, you know, can have competition between two mental states, one that tells you it's time to get up for work and the other that's like, actually go back to bed. Like, I have that competition every single day of my life. And boy, is it a struggle. So I hope you enjoyed this little vignette analysis. Like I said, I think this would be a cool way to sort of engage with the people who may not be able to commit to like watching all of the Let's Plays either live or in the VODs, because you know they can be quite long uploads after all. So let me know what you think about this format, if you enjoyed it. It's great to see so many new people kind of joining the community and getting interested in this stuff. I'm really happy to have you here, and I'm excited to do more of this kind of thing very soon. So that said, next episode is coming shortly after this one, and we'll see you there. Bye. Do you have any competing mental states that you want to share with the class? No. She's perfect as she is.